Hey everyone, this is Mike Wolf, and welcome to the Spoon Podcast. Today's guest is my old and good friend Joe Ray, who you may have heard of, as he's the kitchen tech reviewer for Wired magazine. He spoke at many of our events, and is just a pretty great writer when it comes to reviewing anything around kitchen tech. So I always enjoy having Joe on the podcast to hear what he's thinking. And this podcast was especially fun because, unlike past conversations, I went a little bit more into Joe's background, how he became a kitchen tech reviewer, how he got into food at all and became a journalist. We kind of go way back into the archives, a deep cut conversation with Joe Ray. So I had a lot of fun doing that. If you're at all interested in how you can have a career in writing about food tech or just food in general, Joe's path is an interesting one to listen to. That includes some time in Paris, 10 years, in fact, and lots of travel and working for some pretty impressive people. So it was a bunch of fun catching up with Joe, and I think you'll enjoy this podcast as well. As always, if you want to listen to the Spoon Podcast, you could find it anywhere you find podcasts. You can find it at our website at The Spoon. And if you're a regular listener, we always appreciate you giving us a review and a rating. That always helps out. So, all right, without further waiting, without further ado, let's get to my conversation with Joe Ray. All right, Joe Ray, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks. It's nice to be back.
Well, I told you before we started, this is going to be like two old friends sitting by the fire, and it'll be like two old friends sitting by the fire talking about kitchen tech, because that's really what I love to talk with you about, much like we used to do on stage at the Smart Kitchen Summit. And I want to get into what you're working on, kind of hear your thoughts on things. We're going to get into all that. But before we do, I just want to mention, I mentioned your name in an article recently. I covered the news of Fresco's new kitchen operating system, and they name checked you. Ben Harris, Ben Harris, the CEO of Fresco, formerly Drop, said that your article breaking down and somewhat criticizing their app in the past, I can't remember if that was 2020, 2021, was pretty instrumental in their thinking about their redesign. And so I don't know if you saw that, but I thought that was pretty interesting. And I think it kind of shows how important your writing is.
Aw, well, that's very sweet. It's nice to think that that I'm getting through to someone once in a while. Yeah, Ben writes to me once in a while, and he asks if he can sit me down and pick my brain, and I say, well, no, but
get some free consulting out of you. One of the things I've always liked about your writing about kitchen tech is it's pretty absolutely fearless. You don't really hold back any punches, and I think I appreciate that. And while I think some people who make things that sell to consumers that ultimately get on your review desk are probably pretty fearful of what the Joe Ray review is going to say, I think at the end, a lot of them, like Ben, kind of shows that they appreciate it too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm here for the people who are in the home cook, the people in their kitchens. I'm not here for, we're talking about Ben, so I can say Ben, but I'm not here for Instant Pot or any of the app manufacturers or anyone else other than the people who are cooking. And I just use them as my sort of guiding light. I think of my mom in the kitchen. I think of my sister. I think of different styles of home cooks. And then I try to think of how these products that I'm reviewing will fit into their lives or not. And that's really my whole criteria. I don't think of it as fearlessness. I think of it as helping someone make a good decision on whether or not they need a thing in their kitchen.
I think it's the right approach. I think a lot of modern gadget bloggers don't think that way. They think, hey, I want to write positively about something. So, hey, I can get free stuff sent to me, or people will the brands will share my stuff. I think that But you're a true journalist. I think a lot of times, and not to call bloggers not journalists, I think a lot of them are pretty good writers and they do some valuable work, but I just think there's a difference there. I would say that you remind me of, I think you're in the same school of a guy I think who kind of really started it all in a lot of ways in Walt Mossberg. I don't know if you're familiar with Walt's work, but he was the original tech reviewer for the Wall Street Journal. And he wrote the personal technology column for like 20, 30 years before he went out and started a company with Kara Swisher in Recode. And I wrote an article once for GigGo called, I think, The Mossberg Consumer or something like that. And he was always, and he stated this clearly in his columns a lot. He repeated it a lot, was he wasn't writing for the brands. He wasn't writing for the sophisticated technology person. He was writing for the consumer who just wanted to understand this stuff. What it meant for in their lives and, whether or not they should buy it. And that was always his kind of guiding light.
That rings very true. I mean, there are so many people I think about when I'm reviewing a thing as how it will fit into their kitchen, but I don't think of the manufacturer per se, other than if they've done a good job or not. On the flip side, like I have brands that I love. I have I have knives that I love, and I always talk about my rice cooker. I get into the gear. It's always got to serve a perfect purpose and make someone's cooking better and easier.
And for those of you who don't know Joe, this will probably be pretty obvious to a lot of people, but you write primarily for Wired magazine. You're the smart kitchen reviewer for Wired magazine, which is a pretty sophisticated readership, I would say. I mean, they're not the USA Today reader. But do you publish for any other publications, or do you write for any other? And I know you've written books in the past. You've written books that I think are more centered around the culinary angle, but is your primary writing around kitchen tech still primarily just for Wired?
Primarily for Wired, yes. In a past life, I've been a travel writer. I still try to do that once in a while. I still have some book ideas that I'm kicking around, but Wired is my kind of my bread and butter.
And I probably have brought this up on a past podcast. I think I bring it up every time I interview you, but your early writing when you were in Europe.
Is this the part where we talk about how grumpy I am?
No. I was not going to mention that, Joe, at all. You brought it up, so you have no one to blame but yourself. But speaking of grumpy people, your original writing back in the day, I think when you started in Europe, was for a famous French culinary reviewer, right? And I think wasn't he the inspiration for the culinary reviewer in that Disney movie that I'm now forgetting the name
Ratatouille,
of?
yes.
Ratatouille. Yes. Wasn't he the inspiration for that?
So for years and years, I lived in Europe for 10 years, and most of that was in Paris. And during that time, I wrote restaurant critiques with François Simon, who was and still is known as the best and most feared food critic in France. He, as I understand it, was the inspiration for the critic in the movie Ratatouille. Yes.
And maybe that having such an early exposure to a guy who's pretty hardcore in terms of his opinions, did that shape you in any way? Like, did you learn the ethos of, hey, I need to be perfectly honest, knowing who the readership is and serving only that true North Star?
Oh, for sure. For sure. I mean, our relations, we weren't sharing an office or anything like that, but we would be in pretty regular contact, and it was always with the reader in mind and thinking about like the food they would enjoy, the occasion they would be going to a particular restaurant on, who they might want to go with, that kind of thing. And then I think the real thing I learned was like when you have to do a hard review, which is a negative review, like how clean and thorough you have to be about it.
I think that's important. I mean, I've heard of people who regularly do technology reviews for big publications, not food reviews, but technology side. If they find a product they just hate, they won't do the review because they don't necessarily feel it's worth their time. But also I think they just don't want to trash a brand, but that's not a calculus you make. Is if you get something that in front of you, you review it and you just absolutely do not like the product, you're going to write the review.
It's more nuanced than that. It really, I think it depends if it is a service to the reader or not to do the review. If it's something that is like 1 in 20, hopefully less, I will get something in that I'm interested in, take a look at it, and actually send it back and say, let's not do this. And that's usually like a small manufacturer, and it's just usually not ready for prime time, and it really doesn't serve anyone to do a review about it. Where, on the other hand, if it's a large manufacturer who's pushing some junk out, I'm much more prone to go after and fully write that out. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. It makes sense.
Thanks.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember the name of the sous vide circulator, which the meat was undercooked. You know, I had to bring this up. You probably were fearing that bring up, but it was one which you had a pretty big impact on the company, and it was, what was the name of the?
Mellow.
No, that one was probably a hard one to write, though, wasn't it? Or no?
A negative review is incredibly hard to write. It takes up, I would say, 3 to 5 times as much time.
And is that because you want to make sure you get everything right? You want to validate that, hey, my doubts about this, I have doubts about the product. I want to validate that I'm actually right.
You just have to make sure everything is, you can't give them any reason to come back at you. That's something I learned writing with François Simon. There was this point we're sitting, I think we were in the Ritz in Paris, and he was talking about his negative reviews, and he said, it has to be a clean shot. And he leans over and he touches the center of my forehead as if that where the bullet goes in or something like that. And because of that, you cannot afford to get anything wrong. And so any slip up gives the reviewee a chance to get back up and say, hey, but wait, no, we do this, or you're wrong about that. So I'm not saying I slack off on my positive reviews, but you just have to be that much more careful in a negative review.
Yeah. I wonder what that first day was like going to work for him. I remember my first day working for a big, like what in my world was a big name. I went to work for a guy named Om Malik, which, I don't know if you know Om. He ran Gig Om, which was a pretty seminal early tech blog. And I got the job hired by the CEO, Paul Warborski, and I go in to meet Om, who we'd had a relationship online. It's one of those weird modern relationships where you get to know someone online through email and blogs.
Sure.
I go in there and it's as if he didn't even want to talk to me. Like he was just looking at his BlackBerry the whole time. It was just like and we were at I think a restaurant. It's just one of the weirdest experiences I've ever had. I felt like I didn't even, and I'm like, hired as a vice president of research. It was just one of those weird things. Huh. And so it made me kind of think like maybe kind of famous people, semi-famous people are weird sometimes or different. I don't know. How was your first meeting with this guy?
I can't say that I remember my first meeting with him, but I had been already doing I was doing really well. It was kind of like, I mean, if travel writers have heydays, I was doing probably around the best that I was doing as a travel writer right then. I had a blog where I talked a lot about food products and restaurants, and then I had a mutual friend who introduced Francois and I. And so it wasn't like I was coming into this blind, but I was also coming into it working with the best guy out there, which was fun and a little intimidating. But it was never, he really kind of let me do what I wanted to do. And I'm sure if I'd have messed up, he'd have worked to correct that, let's say. But I really had free reign, and I was lucky in that.
How did you get into travel writing? Like, I think I should know this. I should probably spend more time on your LinkedIn, but were you a journalism major? How did you end up in the writing craft?
So I was in international relations at Syracuse University, and I studied abroad in Strasbourg my entire senior year. And it was really catching on with the language and the culture over there was really the first time academically that I felt like, wow, like this is what I want to do. This is where I want to be. And it was, speaking French isn't a career, nor is being there. So I had to figure out what I wanted to do.
Unfortunately.
So it took me a while to figure out. I had a bunch of like weird jobs after school. After I graduated from college, I was the quote marketing department for an industrial desiccant dehumidifier company in Massachusetts.
I don't know why you gave that up, Joe. I feel like you could have been the desiccation. You could have been the industrial cleaner guy, like the YouTube industrial cleaner guy.
But that was such an awkward fit that I really needed to figure out. Like, it helped push me to figure out what I wanted to do more. And even while I was doing that, like, I took a part-time job as a cook because I had been a line cook in about a dozen restaurants in that time. And I'm going to shorten this story a lot. And I just kind of said, I usually use a stronger word than this, but to hell with it. I'm moving to France. I'm going to be a journalist. I had written for the San Francisco Chronicle a story about restaurant kitchens and what like trying out in a restaurant kitchen was like. I had written for a couple airline magazines in the US, and then I just decided, like, if I don't go to France, I'm not going to go. And that's the one thing that was my dream. And
that's amazing. What time was this?
So I had an internship over there with an internet company in like the late 90s. And then right after 9/11 in October 2001, I moved over there for good. And I joined a press association, and I was trying to figure out like what I was supposed to write about. And I had a contact with the Boston Globe who helped me out a lot. Just kind of like figure out where to put my writing and how, and like in which section and who to talk to. Thank God. But at the time I was a generalist, and I thought that was great, but I was also really struggling to make ends meet. So I was part of a press association, and I met with the guy who was the head of Time magazine in Paris at the time. And essentially I asked him to take me out to lunch and tell me how to do it. And he said, well, are you doing okay? And I was like, not really. And then he said, well, what was the last job that you really loved? And I said, well, I had this dehumidifier job. And he said, no, loved. And I said, oh, I cooked in a restaurant. I've cooked in a bunch of restaurants. And he said, dummy, you're in Paris. Go write about food. And so from there, I was able to figure out that writing for the Boston Globe, their rule was if you want to write for the food section, you need to be able to get in your car from Boston or thereabouts, drive out and go to a restaurant. And if you can't do that, then the food thing you're writing is for the travel section. So I got connected with the travel section, and that was how I got my start as a travel writer.
What a great story. Have you ever gotten back to that Time magazine person and thanked them for the prescient?
Where are you? Well, I'm going back to Paris in a week, so maybe I'll track him down and say thank you.
That's so interesting that you had this point in your career where you just said, I'm getting on a plane after like a month after 9/11, which maybe flights were cheap at that point, but it's an interesting time to go.
I think it really like clarified, like if you, I had this thing that I always wanted to do, and I tried and failed a couple times, and I mean, I don't want to sound all cheesy, but it was my dream. And if you're
What's
not,
all-
I mean,
I-
if you're not going to go through a tragedy like that and come out on the other side and say like, all right, I'm going to give this a go one more time. Like
Yeah.
that was it.
I kind of call those, I feel like big national moments of crisis are give people this get busy living or get busy dying kind of period in their lives where they rethink things. I feel like the same thing happened with COVID. You saw all these people quit their job. It's just one of those things where everyone collectively just goes, what am I doing? What am I doing? Am I doing what I want to love, what I really love? So I think that happened. Sounds like 9/11, that crisis maybe helped push you along a little bit.
My plan was to just say to hell with it and go. And that really sort of, that actually like pushed it back a bit, but then it also solidified and cemented that I was going to go.
You know, it's so interesting. You've written for, Wired. You've written for these other big publications. It's been during a time where there's been a democratization, I think, of publishing, the rise of WordPress. There's been, more recently things like Substack. Mm-hmm. Why? I don't know if you've ever wanted to, maybe you like having a kind of a big publisher kind of handle all the back stuff, kind of background stuff. Have you ever thought about just going out and do Joe Ray's publication?
Oh man. I've thought about it. Sure. Yes. But like, I also think about how difficult that would be. That is not a dream of mine. Say, I could see how that would work, but I don't see that as something I dream of doing. I'd rather do another book, I think.
And that's kind of a micro business in a way, right? Writing a book is the act of going out and putting yourself out there and kind of creating your thing. It's a little business in a sense. So
yeah. And I mean, between my wife, who's also a writer, and I, like we have 2 or 3 businesses between us. Like it's a lot. There's a lot of like stuff that's already on the back end. And I'm watching her put together her newsletter right now for some upcoming work that she's doing. And it's a lot. Like I got plenty to do right now.
Yeah. It makes sense. Well, nowadays you're writing primarily for Wired when you're writing about kitchen tech. And one of the reasons I wanted to get together with you is, although it's been fun, essentially the first half of the podcast has been Joe Ray's career, which I actually really like, because for some reason I never asked you about that. So, but I do want to ask you about your thoughts of where things are today. And I started thinking a little bit about it when I was writing about the Fresco News with the revamp of their operating system. And the lessons they took from you, and they talked to the guy who helped create Android and just rebuilt the thing from the ground up. And it's yet to be seen how successful they'll be. But in a way, they really kind of are the last ones standing, focused on creating this software that will power a lot of these appliances. I mean, and thinking about how everything will connect together. I think if you look at like SideChef or Init and these other guys who are doing digital software to cook, they kind of all went in the direction of, hey, let's look at grocery shopping. We can monetize when people buy groceries. We'll create recipes still and create these consumer apps. But I feel like they veered away a little bit.
Yeah, and right when you say we can monetize, and they try to like get you to buy groceries with their apps while you're also trying to make dinner with your machine, which is your main reason to be there. Like that's where I get off. I'm just. Like,
yeah, I mean,
I understand why they do it, but that's not,
yeah.
I'm just not interested in that at all.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not really here to make a value judgment. I think there's value in like having shoppable recipes, but that's not really the conversation. What the conversation is, I think we've seen a plateau of innovation in the kitchen over the past few years. If we go back in the, 2015, 2016, there's a lot of excitement. We saw the big appliance guys get in. They were talking about having everything connected. There were still like 3 or 4 sous vide circulator startups. June had started. Not soon after we saw Brava.
Right.
Tovala started around that time. And, more recently we have seen companies like Sous Vide doing countertop kitchen contraptions. But it seems like we've hit a little bit of a lull in innovation. And I'm just kind of curious where you see things at. Do you kind of see the same thing?
I think you're onto something there. I was at the Housewares, also known as the Inspired Home Show.
Horrible name, by the way. I'm sorry.
Just that's let's just be nice, and I still call it Housewares.
Everyone calls it houseware still, and I'm going to
Anyway,
continue. Anyway,
but I talked with a colleague there, and they said, "I think the smart kitchen's dead," and I think I agree. But then as soon as you say that, like you'll see like the Fresco thing, or there's guys at Taurus who are making their version of a Thermomix. But I definitely noticed, just like you were saying, like it shot up, it got really interesting. There was all this stuff going on. There were all these apps. Some of them were okay, some of them were bad, a couple of them were good. And then I think kind of during COVID, it really just seemed to plateau, and people, maybe because people really had to cook a lot at home and needed the more practical side of things, but it really felt like it plateaued. And then I started getting more interested in just sort of like better design.
mm-hmm.
And it really hasn't seemed to have picked up any more after plateauing. If anything, it seems to be dropping away more.
Yeah. I think there's a few reasons for that. I think, we saw COVID, and I think we've seen a corresponding, maybe a little bit of a lagged economic downturn.
Mm-hmm.
I think the appliance guys that all jumped in didn't see an immediate return on their investment. They didn't really see like these things flying off shelves. I mean, Samsung, even like the biggest company who is really doing a smart refrigerator, like, and they're the most persistent and the most dedicated to it, has even pulled that thing back a little bit. The family have refrigerator, and they're putting forward, kind of to what you're talking about, a more design forward brand of refrigerator that's really kind of their focus right now. That's that one that you can mix and match different design palettes and put photos on front of your refrigerator, and not talking digital photos in the form of a screen, but actually have a photo of your family or a painting put on your refrigerator. So I think one is just like, there wasn't like an immediate return. It wasn't necessarily resonating, this first conception of the smart kitchen. There has also been a downturn. And so what happened is a lot of those guys that were working in these departments essentially have all left at this point. Yeah.
And I think like what you just said, these guys working in departments kind of is a clue too. Like this wasn't a chef. This never really felt like a chef driven thing. There are some exceptions, sure, but it was a lot of like guys like wanting to make cool stuff in their kitchen or like connect their kitchen devices. And then what would happen would be that they would start to realize they needed really good content, and that content is really good recipes. And that is really hard to do because it takes tons of time and it costs a ton of money, because you need to employ a bunch of people who can not only cook, but code or do both, have one of each.
No. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it was that. I think also there were companies, I think, that were maybe a little bit more about building a community, taking something like they saw out of the modern cuisine movement of this idea of applying precision heating. So you saw like, Scott Heimendinger with trying to build Sancerre.
Right.
You saw Chris Young.
My favorite sous vide machine. I still have one.
Chris Young, helped write Modern Cuisine, starting Chef Steps, which was a community first before it ever became a hardware company. And that first community they built was really, really, really something to it. I think it was really popular, and they were creating great content back then.
And Thermomix, for example, also had some really fantastic content, and that's really what makes their machine work. But so many others would kind of like nudge up to that line and kind of like make a few things, and then, realize like there's a way you write a recipe. There's a way you talk about how you like chop an onion. Yeah. There's an order you put stuff in a good recipe. And you could tell almost immediately when you scanned a recipe whether or not it was going to, whether or not someone who knew what they were doing had put it together or not.
Yeah. And those things that evolved out of like popular products And by that, I'm really kind of referring to something like the Thermomix. I think were still valuable, and I think became more valuable. I think the most recent generation of the Thermomix I liked what they did with it. They weren't trying to over engineer on the technology, and I think there's something there in the original Thermomix that was obviously valuable. That thing's like 30 years old, the platform. Right. But yeah, a lot of the guys are just trying to say, hey, I'm a roboticist, and I think robots should make our food. You know, we haven't seen anything coming out of that movement that's really succeeded at this point. Not in
the home kitchen which is where I pay attention. Like, yeah, not really, no.
But I think just to kind of give things a positive note, I think that it's oftentimes these quiet periods where you have the guys who are really in it. Like, and by that, I'll refer back to like, you know, Chris Young,
right?
Scott Heimaninger, who's filing patents on some secret new kitchen thing, who obviously has a love for food.
Right. Mr. Stealth Mode.
Mr. Stealth Mode. They're building something. And there's been a few other examples of companies that are building something interesting. So I expect, like, maybe it's not this year, maybe it's not next year, but I think we're going to see a new wave of stuff. And it's not going to be all centered around, hey, I can, you know, make this, you know, my refrigerator talk to my oven. I think, you know, what Fresco's building, there's something there that ultimately could be valuable, but they may be the last ones who are doing it. So maybe they're the one who builds that operating system. But I think there are a lot of people doing interesting stuff in the kitchen that we just don't know about right now.
I hope so.
Is that because you want more stuff to review for Wired, Joe?
No, I mean, I can find, luckily, like I have a fair amount of leeway in what I do. And if something's just well designed or works really well, I can write about it. It doesn't have to be app connected, but like if those things are out there, I'd love to check them out. Or if they're out there in a year or two,
yeah,
I'll be ready.
Well, one category that's come out, I think I don't know if it's up your alley, but I think I've seen a wave of products around just better managing food waste. And it's not really cooking. And it's almost like they're trying to smartify the compost bin. So it's not really about culinary creation, but this seems like that's been a wave. There's a startup, I think about 6 months ago, that started a bunch of former Nest folks, which I wish they spent more time on just helping us keep our food fresh and not actually figuring out what to do with it once it's gone bad, because I think like that you kind of lost the battle at that point.
Yeah, I really enjoy seeing people thinking about how we waste or don't waste our food and help us come up with better ways to not waste it. I've looked at, I think it was a Thermomix product that had a different name that did some composting, which it was kind of tiny, but like it worked all right. And that you do in your kitchen, you just kind of can set it off in a corner and put in your food waste. Is it Ends and Stems? Was someone I met at a Smart Kitchen Summit long ago, and that is really about like how to plan meals so you don't waste food.
Yeah, and that's really driven by her and the person behind it. Who we'll put that in the show notes because my memory's fading, Joe. There are a few companies. Speaking of companies that are maybe went into dark mode during the COVID pandemic and maybe are emerging, there's been a cohort of companies trying to rethink the idea of Tupperware. One of those that I was excited about early on, you probably remember Silo, they were making these smart home food storage bins, and they basically almost went out of business. They were really kind of hurt by the pandemic, partly because they were trying to manufacture in China. But since then, the founder says he's raised new money. He's rehired an engineering staff. So I think I backed that like in 2018 on Kickstarter, and I'm still waiting for it. But I'm still hoping it shows up. But that would be a good one for you to review if it ever comes out.
I'll keep an eye open.
I'll let you borrow mine if I ever get it. So, Hey, but Joe, this is always fun to catch up with you. It's always great to hear what you're thinking about. I've so often said you're my favorite kitchen tech reviewer, and so I always enjoy reading your stuff, and I think everyone else should read it.
Thanks, Mike. It's always such a pleasure to be on the show with you.
All right, we'll talk soon.
Thanks. Take care.
That was lots of fun. We went way deeper into Joe's background and history than I even anticipated. It's one of those free-flowing conversations where I really didn't even write down notes and prepare because I knew Joe and I can just have a fun conversation sitting by this fireside, if we will, just talking about old times and where we're going and what we're writing about. So it was a lot of fun to hear about that with Joe. You could catch his writing at Wired Magazine, wired.com. Just Google for Joe Ray. Find him on Twitter as well. I think you'll enjoy following him. So, all right, that's it for now. We'll have a new podcast soon. But for now, we'll talk to you later.